There is something that happens in the lives of some empaths that almost no one around can notice. It is not a visible event. It is not an announced decision. It is not a rupture full of explanations. To those watching from the outside, it seems like just another ordinary day. The person continues to live, work, talk, smile at times. Nothing feels dramatically different, but inside her, something profound has already begun to change. Carl Jung said that some transformations of the soul happen in silence because they belong to a dimension that the external world cannot see. They don't need witnesses. They do not need approval. They are born when a person begins to realize, almost inevitably, that the old version of himself can no longer continue living in the same way. The lone empath knows this moment very well. For a long time he tried to adapt. He tried to understand others before he understood himself. He tried to maintain ties, maintain presences, maintain relationships that seemed important to everyone around. He believed that part of his role was to stay there, available, understanding, emotionally present. And for a long time this seemed natural, almost as if it were his own destiny. But there comes a point when something inside the empath begins to awaken to a quiet truth. It is not a bitter truth. It is not a revolt against the world. It's something deeper than that. It is the realization that the soul can no longer continue living just to sustain stories that no longer belong to who it has become. And when this perception is born, it brings with it a curious sense of clarity. Many things that once seemed confusing start to make sense. Many relationships that once seemed inevitable now reveal their true place in the soul's journey. The empath begins to realize that part of the path he has taken has not been just about love or care. It was also about learning, about invisible limits, and about the slow discovery of who he really is. This is a rare moment in the life of any sensitive person. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is profoundly transformative. It is the moment when the empath realizes that his sensitivity was not born to imprison him in stories that do not reflect his true essence. She was born to guide him back to himself. Carl Jung believed that every real process of transformation involves the end of an old identity. Something inside the person needs to die symbolically so that a new consciousness can be born. And for the empath, this process usually happens very silently, almost invisible to the world around them. Because while everyone continues to live their routines, hoping that everything remains the same, the empath begins to feel that something inside him is rearranging. He begins to feel a different kind of tranquility, a calm that no longer depends on anyone's approval, an inner presence that no longer needs to be explained. And it is at this moment that many people begin to notice something curious. The empath no longer reacts in the same way. He no longer enters into the same emotional dynamics. He no longer feels the need to justify every choice, every silence, every absence. Not because he stopped caring, but because something inside him has finally found a deeper place of belonging, a place where he no longer has to divide himself between who he is and who the world expected him to be. And when an empath reaches this point in the journey, something starts to happen naturally. It is not an abrupt decision. It is not a break full of explanations. It is only a silent movement of the soul, as if it is slowly returning to its own center. Some ties begin to dissolve. Some presences no longer make sense. Some stories simply end without anyone having to declare the end. To those who observe from the outside, this may seem strange, it may seem distant, it may even seem inexplicable. But for the empath who is going through this moment, the feeling is very different. It's as if, for the first time in a long time, he's coming home to himself. And when this return happens, something becomes very clear. There are journeys that do not allow you to return to the old version of who you were. And perhaps one of the quietest transformations in the life of an empath is exactly this. The moment when he breaks ties without hatred, without anger, without the need for confrontation, simply because your soul has finally found the courage to continue on the path it was born to take. The silent moment when the empath realizes that he no longer belongs in the same places. There is a very specific moment in the journey of the empath that is rarely noticed by those around him. It is not an external event. There is no dramatic scene. There is no announcement. There is no sudden breakup that everyone can observe. On the outside, life continues with the same appearance as always. The conversations continue to happen. The routines follow their course. The meetings seem the same as before. But inside the empath, something begins to move very deeply. Carl Jung said that the human soul has moments of awakening that are not caused by visible events, but by a slow inner reorganization. It is as if a very old part of the psyche begins to realize that it can no longer continue living in the same way. For the empath, this awakening often begins with a feeling that is difficult to explain. It's not sadness. It is not rejection. It is not simple fatigue. It's more like a silent perception of misalignment. What once seemed natural begins to feel heavy. Places where he used to feel present begin to seem strangely distant. Conversations that used to fill time now sound empty. Emotional dynamics that once seemed inevitable begin to reveal something he had never seen clearly. For a long time, the empath believed that he was part of that environment. He believed that his role was to understand, welcome, balance emotions, maintain harmony around him. This deep sensitivity has always been a kind of natural language of his soul. But when the process of transformation begins, something changes in the way this sensitivity works. It stops being just an emotional radar aimed at others and begins to turn inward. And when that happens, the empath begins to realize something that can be profoundly revealing. Many of the connections he held were not sustained by the same depth of consciousness. It is not a question of judgment. It is not about superiority. It is just about perception. He begins to feel that certain presences belong to an earlier phase of his journey, that certain environments were linked to a version of him that needed to learn, experiment, adapt. This perception can bring a curious mix of emotions. There is a kind of silent nostalgia, such as when we realize that something important is coming to an end. There is also a sense of clarity that, while reassuring, also completely changes the way reality is seen. The empath begins to realize that staying in the same places no longer produces growth. It no longer produces inner truth. Carl Jung described this moment as one of the most delicate points of individuation. This is when the person begins to realize that his soul is naturally moving away from everything that no longer corresponds to his true path. This distancing does not happen out of anger. It doesn't happen because of rejection. It happens by alignment. It is as if the soul is slowly repositioning itself towards its own center. And when this happens, the empath begins to realize that some presences no longer have the same emotional weight. Some stories are no longer necessary. Some bonds simply cease to sustain the same energetic connection. And the most curious thing is that this process happens without noise. The empath does not need to announce that he is changing. He doesn't need to confront anyone. He does not need to explain something that belongs to the deepest level of his own consciousness. He just begins to withdraw internally. And this departure is the first sign that a much greater transformation has already begun within him. Because when the soul realizes that it no longer belongs to the same places, it naturally begins to look for a space where it can exist in a truer way. And it is at this point that the empath's journey begins to enter a new phase, a phase where the old identity slowly begins to dissolve to make way for something more authentic, more whole, more aligned with who they really are. When sensitivity ceases to be adaptation and begins to become consciousness. For much of their life, the empath learns to use their sensitivity as a way of adapting to the world. From a very early age, he perceives emotions that other people do not. It captures mood swings, invisible tensions, unspoken feelings that circulate among people. This skill, while profound, is often born within environments where emotional awareness is not shared in the same way. Therefore, the empath learns something very specific without even realizing it. He learns to adjust. He learns to perceive what others feel before he even thinks about what he himself feels. He learns to maintain emotional balance in the environments where he is. For a long time, this seems to be simply part of their nature. It seems like a natural feature of your personality. But when the process of inner awakening begins, this dynamic begins to change profoundly. Sensitivity is no longer just a tool for adaptation. It begins to transform into consciousness. And this change completely alters the way the empath perceives their relationships, their environments, and even their own identity. Before, his sensitivity led him to sustain bonds. Now she begins to reveal truths. He begins to notice emotional patterns that previously went unnoticed. You begin to notice when certain relationships are maintained only out of habit. You begin to feel when your presence is being used more as emotional support than as a true exchange. This type of perception does not generate anger. It generates lucidity. Carl Jung believed that consciousness is born precisely when a person begins to see what was previously hidden in the deepest layers of the psyche. It is the moment when perception ceases to be automatic and becomes conscious. For the empath, this transition can be extremely powerful, because for the first time, he begins to realize that his sensitivity no longer needs to be used to maintain balances that do not belong to him. It can be used to recognize what really makes sense for your soul. This change produces a very specific kind of inner freedom. The empath begins to feel that they no longer need to react automatically to everything that happens around them. He begins to realize that he can simply observe, understand, and follow his own internal rhythm. This new awareness creates a space within him, a space where the old identity begins to dissolve. The old identity was very much linked to the role of the one who sustains, who understands, who keeps the bonds alive even when they are no longer aligned. But when the consciousness awakens, the empath begins to perceive something very important. Not all ties need to be maintained forever. Some connections exist only for certain stages of life. Some relationships fulfill their role and then naturally dissolve. This perception does not diminish the value of what was experienced. On the contrary, it allows the empath to see their own journey with more maturity, more serenity, and more truth. Because when sensitivity is transformed into consciousness, the empath stops living only by reacting to the emotional world around him. He begins to live from himself. And this change marks the beginning of one of the most profound phases of inner transformation. A phase in which the empath is no longer just someone who feels deeply and begins to become someone who deeply understands himself. The day the empath stops sustaining stories that no longer represent his soul. There is a very specific moment in the path of the empath when something inside him reorganizes itself definitively. It is not a rational decision. It is not an elaborate plan. It is not a change caused by a single event. It is a slow, silent awakening, almost imperceptible at first, but which completely transforms the way he relates to the world. For a long time, the empath sustained stories that were not only his. He sustained emotional dynamics, maintained presences, held bonds that seemed important to maintain balance around him. He often believed that his role was to stay there, to be the point of understanding, to be the person who can feel most deeply, who can perceive what no one says out loud. This sensitivity for years worked as a bridge between him and others, But there comes a time when this bridge begins to reveal something that was not visible before. The empath begins to realize that many of these stories were being held back only by his emotional presence. Not because other people were necessarily incapable of feeling, but because the empath quietly took on the role of sustaining what others could not see. Carl Jung said that the journey of individuation requires that the person, at some point, stop living through the invisible expectations of the environment in which he grew up. He needs to start living from his own inner truth. For the empath, this moment can be deeply revealing, because he begins to realize that many of the stories he sustained were linked to an old version of himself, a version that was still learning who it was, what its place was, what its own voice was within the world. This perception does not bring revolt, it brings clarity. And when clarity appears, the empath begins to feel something very particular. He can no longer continue to participate in certain dynamics in the same way. Not because he wants to step aside, but because something inside him has already transformed. Conversations that once seemed natural start to feel repetitive. Environments that once seemed familiar begin to feel disconnected from your inner energy. It is as if the soul began to realize that that story has already fulfilled its role. And when a story fulfills its role, it doesn't have to be destroyed. It just ends. This is one of the quietest moments of the empath's transformation. He begins to slowly withdraw his emotional energy from places where he no longer needs to be. There is no advertisement. There is no long explanation. There is only a natural movement of consciousness. The empath begins to invest more time in silence, in reflection, in contact with his own interiority. He begins to realize that there is a much deeper inner life waiting to be explored. And when this inner life begins to expand, many external stories are no longer necessary. Carl Jung believed that true psychological growth happens when a person finds the courage to allow certain parts of life to end, not for loss, but by evolution. For the empath, this process marks the moment when he stops living sustaining collective stories and begins to live in line with his own soul. It's a delicate point in the journey because on the outside, people may not understand what is happening, but within the empath, everything starts to make sense. He begins to realize that some stories were not destined to last forever. They were meant to teach him who he needed to become. The silent death of the old identity that tried to keep everyone around. Carl Jung described deep psychological transformation as a process that always involves a kind of symbolic death. It is not a literal death, but the end of an identity that no longer corresponds to the inner truth of the person. For the empath, this symbolic death is usually extremely silent. For much of his life, he built an identity based on connecting with others. He learned to feel deeply, to understand complex emotions, to maintain lively relationships even when they were going through difficult times. This ability became a fundamental part of who he believed himself to be. He was the person who remained, the person who understood, the person who tried to maintain bridges between people. But when the inner journey deepens, the empath begins to realize something that completely changes the way he sees himself. He begins to realize that this identity was built at a specific stage of his life, a phase in which he was still learning to recognize his own worth, a phase in which he believed that always remaining emotionally available was the deepest form of love. Over time, though, something inside him begins to mature. Awareness grows, perception deepens, and the empath begins to realize that his existence no longer has to revolve around keeping everyone around. He begins to realize that true connection does not require constant effort. It happens naturally when two consciousnesses are aligned. This perception causes a profound change in the identity of the empath. The old version of him, the one that tried to sustain all the bonds, slowly begins to disappear. And this can generate a very introspective moment in the journey. Because when an old identity begins to symbolically die, the person can feel a kind of temporary emptiness, not because something is wrong, but because the soul is rearranging itself. Carl Jung said that this emptiness is part of the transformation process. It is the space where the new identity begins to be born. For the empath, this space can be surprisingly quiet. He begins to realize that he no longer has to carry all the emotions of the environment around him. You no longer need to ensure that all links remain intact. You no longer need to explain every silence, every absence, every inner change. He begins to feel something that he may never have felt before so clearly: emotional freedom. This freedom is not accompanied by coldness. It is accompanied by a new form of presence, a more centered presence, more aware, more connected with her own essence. And when this new presence begins to consolidate, something very important happens. The empath realizes that his old identity no longer exists. He's no longer that person who needs to stay in every story. He is no longer that person who needs to keep all the bonds alive. He became something different, something more aligned with one's own soul. And when this transformation happens, the breaking of certain ties is no longer a conscious act. He becomes just a natural consequence of who the empath has become, the integration of the shadow and the birth of a new inner strength. There is a phase of the empath's journey that is rarely understood by those who observe from the outside. For a long time, their sensitivity was directed mainly outward. He perceived emotions, captured invisible pain, understood feelings that were often not even expressed. This ability made him deeply connected to the emotional world of the people around him. But at some point in the inner journey, that same sensitivity begins to turn inward. Carl Jung called this moment the encounter with the shadow. The shadow is not something negative. It represents everything that has been hidden within the psyche throughout life. Parts of the personality that have been silenced, emotions that could not be expressed, impulses that have been contained to maintain harmony, to preserve relationships, or simply to survive emotionally in certain environments. For many empaths, the shadow contains something very specific: strength itself. For years, perhaps decades, this force remained hidden because the priority was always to maintain balance around it. The empath has learned to soften his presence, to diminish his own impulses, to avoid any expression that could generate conflict or discomfort. But when the process of individuation begins to deepen, this dynamic changes. Consciousness begins to reveal parts of the psyche that have been dormant. The empath begins to perceive emotions that he did not allow him to feel before. He begins to recognize limits that he previously ignored. He begins to realize that within him there is an energy that is no longer willing to remain hidden. This encounter with the shadow can be profoundly transformative. Not because he becomes someone hard or distant, but because he begins to integrate within himself what has always been there. The sensitivity remains, but now it is accompanied by something new: inner clarity. The empath begins to realize that their empathy no longer has to mean dissolving their own identity. He begins to realize that understanding others does not require abandoning himself. This understanding completely changes the way your energy manifests in the world. Before, their presence was often quietly adaptive. Now, his presence begins to carry a kind of inner gravity. It's not something he needs to demonstrate. It is not something that needs to be affirmed. It is simply a new quality of consciousness that comes into existence within him. Carl Jung said that when the shadow is integrated, the person is no longer fragmented. The parts that were once separate within the psyche begin to align. For the empath, This creates something very rare, a silent force, a force that does not depend on external approval, does not depend on the validation of the people around it, and no longer needs to justify its emotional existence. He begins to realize that he can continue to be deeply sensitive without having to get lost within the emotions of others. This is one of the most important phases of inner transformation, because it is at this point that the empath begins to feel something that they may never have felt so clearly before. Inner power, not a power based on control, but a power based on presence. He realizes that his sensitivity is now accompanied by awareness, that your empathy is now balanced by a deep understanding of yourself, and when this integration happens, something inside it becomes extremely stable. The need to maintain certain bonds naturally disappears. The need to explain your choices disappears. The empath begins to walk with a tranquility that is born from within. And this tranquility marks the birth of a new identity, an identity that is not built to please the world, but to reflect the truth of one's own soul. The rise of the lonely empath who learns to belong to himself. There is a form of loneliness that is not born from the absence of people. It is born from the discovery of oneself. For a long time, the empath may have believed that being surrounded by connections was synonymous with belonging, that maintaining relationships, maintaining emotional presence, maintaining closeness was the natural way to exist in the world. But as the inner journey deepens, he begins to realize something surprising. True belonging does not depend on how many people are around. It depends on the relationship that the person has with himself. Jung believed that individuation inevitably leads to a certain degree of conscious loneliness. Not a bitter loneliness, but a loneliness that arises when one stops living according to collective expectations and begins to live according to one's own conscience. For the empath, this phase may seem strange at first. He begins to realize that he needs more silence, needs more internal space. It needs moments when it can simply exist without the need to constantly respond to the emotions around it. This movement does not represent emotional withdrawal. It represents inner maturity. The empath begins to discover something extremely powerful. He can be deeply connected to life without having to be constantly immersed in the emotional dynamics of others. He can feel deeply and yet remain centered. He can love without having to dissolve. This discovery completely changes the way he lives his relationships. The connections that remain in your life come into existence in a much more authentic way. They are not sustained by emotional need, but by alignment. And many other connections simply cease to make sense, not because there was conflict, not because there was a dramatic rupture, but because the soul of the empath has already moved elsewhere in the journey. Jung described this process as the ascension of individual consciousness. The person begins to walk guided by something deeper than external expectations. He begins to feel that there is an inner direction that drives his life. For the empath, this direction often leads to a much quieter state of presence. He no longer needs to prove anything. He no longer needs to justify his silence. You no longer need to participate in stories that no longer reflect your truth. This new way of existing creates a very particular feeling, a sense of inner peace. It is not a peace based on external circumstances. It is a peace that is born when the person finally allows himself to live in line with his own essence. The empath begins to realize that the loneliness that once seemed frightening actually contains something extremely valuable. It contains space. Space to feel one's own soul. Space to realize who he really became. Space to live a life that no longer depends on constant validation from the world around you. And when this peace begins to settle within him, something very clear reveals itself. The empath is not alone. He simply learned to belong to himself. The point of no return. When the empath silently breaks ties and never comes back. There is a final phase in the empath's journey that is almost never understood by those around him. Not because it is something mysterious or inaccessible, but because it happens at such a deep level of consciousness that it can hardly be explained in simple words. It is the moment when inner transformation becomes irreversible. For a long time, the empath walked through different phases of his own life, trying to understand what he felt, trying to find balance between his sensitivity and the world around him. He tried to adapt, he tried to understand, he tried to maintain connections that seemed important, to maintain a sense of belonging. But all these phases were part of a larger process. Carl Jung described the journey of individuation as a path that leads inevitably to a point of no return, a moment when the person stops living according to old psychological structures and starts living according to a deeper awareness of himself. For the empath, this point often manifests itself very silently. There is no specific event that marks this instant. There is no final discussion. There is no dramatic rupture that declares the end of something. What happens is much more subtle than that. Something inside it simply rearranges itself. The old way of existing can no longer return. The person he was for so many years no longer corresponds to the consciousness that now dwells within him. And when this change happens, certain bonds begin to disappear naturally, not because the empath has decided to cut ties, but because the emotional energy that sustained these connections no longer exists in the same way. For a long time, the empath sustained relationships through his ability to feel deeply. He was often the invisible link that kept certain stories alive. His emotional presence maintained balances, understandings, bridges between people. But now, something has changed. He no longer needs to occupy this role. Your consciousness has become broader, more centered, more aligned with your own essence. He no longer feels the need to stay in places that no longer reflect who he has become. And when this happens, the rupture does not happen as a conscious gesture. It happens as a natural movement of the soul. The empath simply moves on. He continues his life, continues his inner journey, continues to explore deeper dimensions of his own existence. But certain bonds are left behind because they belong to an earlier phase of your consciousness. Carl Jung said that true psychological transformation always involves the abandonment of something old, not as a loss, but as evolution. The empath begins to realize that his life is entering a new cycle, a cycle where your energy is no longer directed to maintain old structures. Now it is directed to something much deeper, the construction of one's own inner truth. This is the point at which the empath begins to feel a freedom that once seemed impossible. He realizes that he can live without carrying the emotional weight of stories that are no longer part of his journey. He realizes that he can love the people who have been part of his life without having to remain within the same dynamics. He realizes that some connections were important not because they were supposed to last forever, but because they helped shape who he needed to become. And when that understanding matures within him, something very powerful happens. The empath stops looking back with doubt. He stops questioning whether he should have stayed, whether he should have explained more, whether he should have tried again. Because now he knows that certain journeys belong only to his own soul. He knows that some goodbyes happen in silence, because they are part of a transformation that does not need witnesses. And perhaps this is the deepest characteristic of the empath that went through all these phases. He doesn't break ties in anger. He does not disappear out of indifference. He just keeps walking, because when the soul finally finds its own way, she never returns to the old version of who she was.